Good evening. I hope we get started better than we did Sunday. But those of you who were with us Sunday know we had some technical difficulties, and it was actually 10 minutes late before we got started. Those who came expecting that we'd be talking on time, probably some of them dropped off and weren't with us, but I hope you all came back for today. We're still working with the subject of the biblical account of Esther, and I find in it probably this time in my own personal going through this subject and reading the book and rereading, and that there's a lot more in it that's relevant today than I probably figured in years gone by. Because one of the things that's interesting about the nation Israel is people have been trying to exterminate the nation Israel all the way back really to when the nation Israel was in Egypt in bondage. And the Pharaoh in charge at that time was hoping to eliminate the growth of the people because he was afraid if they were ever in a war, they might turn against the Egyptians in favor of whoever the enemy was and be a bad deal. But that didn't stop, because one of the things that God told Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the 12 tribes was that they made a commitment that whatever God told them to do at Mount Sinai, they would do, and they didn't even know what he was going to tell them. But sometimes when we're not too wise, we make commitments we can't keep, and that's one they made. They couldn't keep it. And actually, in the epistles, the Holy Spirit reveals to us that part of the reason the Apostle Paul tells us in Romans that the law was given was that every mouth that would open up and say, all God tells us to do, we'll do, every mouth will be shut, and everyone become guilty before God. That's part of the reason the Mosaic law was given. It was never given as a 10-rung stepladder by which, if you diligently kept the law, you could make your way into favor with God. That was not the plan. And in Galatians, the Apostle Paul tells us that the law was a schoolmaster to lead them to Christ, which, as we observe what they were not able to do in keeping the Mosaic law and the consequences that they were told were going to be the results, we should know, and everybody should know, that it really is not by works of righteousness that we have done, but according to his mercy, he saved us by the washing of regeneration and renewing of the Holy Spirit. And if we don't learn that from our study of the Hebrew Scriptures, then we're missing the point. We're missing the reason for the story, and that's too bad. But we're approaching the end of the book of Esther, and I think Esther is a person that is demonstrating, as she is faced with the challenge of having to, as a relatively new married wife to Ahasuerus, the king, and as a new queen, certainly a new role for her, having been raised as an orphan. Her parents died early in her life, and I don't know that we know the cause of their death, but they died. It could have been in part of what caused them as Jews to be under the control of Ahasuerus, King Ahasuerus, a Gentile. But whatever it was, she lost her parents early, was raised by a cousin who obviously loved the Lord and believed in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and had taught his cousin some really important, practical, functional truths about how to get along in life and be at peace with God and have peace from God, I believe, as she faced the fact that it was apparently going to be her lot to present herself uninvited to the king Ahasuerus, her husband, her new husband, her new king, and she had the new queen, and since she was not invited, there was the possibility that she would be killed. Because if you weren't invited and you showed up in the area, the king's throne, why, if he didn't see fit to approve, you were killed. It was a law. If he didn't approve, you were killed. But she was willing to make that sacrifice, or a potential sacrifice, and God blessed her in it. And so when she was asked by the king, what did she desire, even up to and including half the kingdom? And the way she handled it, I think, was wise, very wise. And I guess one of the things that I want to do this evening is try to help all of us make it a habit as we read the scriptures to say, what is there in that story that could practically apply to me? And I think that all of us, as we go through life, we learn, and if we were saved later in life, we hopefully learn quickly, because you've got the same amount of things to learn everybody else had to learn. You just don't have as much time to learn it and able to and to function in a way that would please God. Because she didn't go to pieces emotionally. She didn't go weeping or screaming into the throne room, telling what all her problems were and how that this guy Haman, that was his number 2 man in the kingdom, had decided that he should, and got the king to go along with a decree that became law that they couldn't change according to the code of the Medes and the Persians. And it gave everybody the right and the responsibility to destroy all the Jews, men, women, children, to annihilate them. And she did, and that would be enough to make most people panic. But she didn't panic. I don't know that the king had any idea how traumatic situation his queen was dealing with. If she had, when she heard about it from Mordecai, what the decree was, if she'd have gone into a panic and crawled up on the bed and curled into a fetal position and sobbed for 3 days, and somebody that thought maybe the king would care would let him know that, I don't know whether you can help your queen or not, but she's terribly distraught, and she's not incognito, but she's not making good sense, and we can't figure out what the problem is, and she won't talk to anybody, and that would not be a good deal for the king. It would not have been a good deal for the queen. It would not be indicating, and this is what I hope all of us get from it, that she was in possession of the peace that passes all understanding that we read about it from the Apostle Paul. And if you don't have a relationship with God, that is a relationship where you love him, fear him, respect him, reverence him, and are committed to serving him with the confidence that he'll come through with what he said he will do on your behalf, you can't have that peace. You may talk about it, but you don't have it. So when she had her opportunity to talk to the king early on in presenting her problem, she invited him to come to a banquet of wine that very afternoon. And so they had a banquet of wine. And again, the king asked her, what do you want? I'll give you anything you want, including half the kingdom. And she doesn't come apart or doesn't begin to tell her woes or her fears or anything. She said, I'd like to have the presence of yourself and Mr. Haman for another banquet tomorrow. And I'll tell you then what I have on my mind. And Okay, you say, well, what's she stalling around about? I mean, why doesn't she get to the point? Well, there's a lot of dynamics in interpersonal relationships, particularly if you have a situation where you are subject to a person as a king and you are the wife of this person that is the king, and then you're the queen also, and your people are Jews that are hated by a significant, at least significant as far as power in that time, the man that was number two to the king, significant position where they could put the hurting on you. And they had a decree passed by the king that would, at a certain date, give others the right to annihilate you. That was a pretty intense situation. But she handles it very calmly and very cool and very collectively. And then in the course of that, I won't recap all the story, but in the course of that, in anticipation of how I don't know how to put this because I can't imagine the conceit of a man if he was number two man, counselor of the king, and he is asked what by the king what he would think would be appropriate to do for a person the king wanted to honor because the person had done something that was really very kind and may have protected the king's life, and he doesn't tell him who it is or what the situation is. The king doesn't tell this guy Haman, but he said, well, "What do you think ought to be done to honor such a person?" And he names a number of things, and he apparently had, I don't know whether he thought about it before or not, but things that he would like to have had done because he thought, who else would the king want to honor but me? I mean, that's ultimate egotism. But so he names wear the king's robe and wear the king's crown and ride the king's horse and have the right decoration on the horse and blue and white colors and be led through the streets by the most noble man in the king's cabinet or officials and declare to everybody that this is what happens to the person that the king would like to honor. And he was told, this guy Mordecai that's sitting out in front quite often, I want you to take him and do that. Well, Mordecai was a man that he hated. And he was a man that he had just finished. Haman had just finished that suggestion of his wife and friends that he build a gallows 50 cubits high. And he was coming to talk to the king because he wanted the king to give him the right to hang Mordecai on it. And instead, he gets the privilege of leading Mordecai through the town, dressed in the way that Haman would like to have been dressed and led through the town. And someone saying about Haman, this is what happens to the man that the king would like to honor. But at the same time, he was invited again to this second banquet, and it's really interesting. He's home after he leads Haman through the city. He covers his head. We're told that twice in this story, Haman's head is covered. This time, the first time, he does it himself and bows his head and goes home and then tells his family how wonderful he is and how wealthy he is, but nothing is worth anything as long as this guy Mordecai refuses to bow down to him. And in the course of that, he gets some advice from his family, his wife actually, from his wife and his counselors. And I tried to emphasize it Sunday, emphasizing it again, because I think we live in a time, you listen to the news in one university after another, we hear of riots and riots that won't stop, and they're supposed to be protesting because they are against the Jews who were attacked by a neighboring country fighting a war against them to try to stop them from being able to do that again. And lots of people have died and are dying on both sides. But the advice that Haman got, kind of late maybe, but he got it from his wife Zeresh and his wise man. And to me, it's an amazing bit of insight. Now, then, I don't know what all it was based on. The Jews, of course, that were there in Persia were captives, basically, that had been transported, going back maybe as far back as Nebuchadnezzar, some of them. And some of them have probably been born in that country. And they were Jews. They were of Jewish descent. And so when they found out that Haman was having trouble with somebody of Jewish descent, they said, if Mordecai, this is a quote, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. I don't know whether that's an insight that God gave them at that point, or whether they knew something of the history of the nation Israel. I assume they did. And what God had promised the nation Israel, and maybe knew that partially the reason the nation Israel was scattered and being scattered all over the face of the earth was because they disobeyed God. But then historically, they'd already established that when they disobeyed God, he punished them through using other nations who attacked them. And when they repented and cried out to God for mercy, he protected them and saved them and enabled them to defeat at least enough to put those people off their list of people that are causing problems for a while. I don't know. But then when I think about today, there are a significant and apparently growing group of people in the United States that has been all my lifetime very much pro-Israel, at least as our public stance. Now, then I know there have always been anti-Semites, but we as a country, we as a politician, it was not good politics to take a stand against Israel or the success of Israel or the needs of Israel. But today, things are turning a corner, it looks like. And there are those who will openly say in this country, and some even politicians, that they want to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women. And they've added to it in their thinking, from sea to shining sea. And to me, it's amazing the similarity between the goals of Haman and the goals of anti-Semites today, whatever country they're in and nationality they are and whatever. And I want to emphasize to anybody that I can emphasize it to, that the last passage of scripture we ended with Sunday was Romans chapter 11. And there's a statement in it. The Apostle Paul is writing, and he says in Romans 11:29, the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. The gifts and callings of God are irrevocable. And the question is, has God cast away the nation Israel? The question is, will Israel ever be restored back to that land and be the head and not the tail of the nations? That's the question. That's the subject. And the point is that what God promised Abraham, confirmed to Isaac and Jacob and the 12, and all of the Hebrew scriptures, most all of the Hebrew scriptures after Genesis 12, are about that group of people, prophecies about them, promises to them, warnings to them, the Mosaic law, which they got because they opened their big mouth and overloaded their back and said, all that God tells us to do, we'll do. And God said, okay, let's see what you can do. But they couldn't. And they didn't have and haven't had as a nation, based particularly on their leadership, not that there are not many people among the nation Israel that love the Lord, are Christians, are saved sinners. In some cases, there's some that don't even realize that really the fact that they're Jews is not all that significant. But anyway, but they do love the Lord, and they do accept Jesus as their Messiah, and they have some understanding that God isn't through with the nation Israel, but they don't rightly divide, so they don't realize that in this period of time, that's not God's program, and He isn't using the Mosaic law, but the gifts and callings of God are irrevocable. Nobody, any more than Haman was able, are going to be able to destroy the nation Israel, annihilate the nation Israel. And they can say it in any kind of flowery way they want it. And some people are so ignorant about the subject that they think that the nation Israel didn't occupy that land until sometime in 1940. But that's foolishness. But again, the statement from Romans 11, and read the whole chapter of Romans. I think if I remember correctly, 9, 10, 11 in Romans are all kind of relevant on that subject. The gifts and the callings of God are irrevocable. For as you were once, talking to Gentiles in this context, you were once disobedient to God, yet have now obtained mercy through their disobedience. In other words, since Israel rejected God's law, disobeyed God's law, and when the Messiah was sent, rejected their Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, and said, oh, we know who he is. His father was a carpenter. Well, that wasn't his father. But they rejected their Messiah, and he suffered and died for the sins of all mankind. And that's why Gentiles obtained mercy, because of the death of the Jewish Messiah. But the gifts and callings of God, the promises of God, are irrevocable. They were promised that land, and they were promised descendants, and they were promised kings, and it was an everlasting covenant, and it hasn't been fulfilled in finality, but it will. And everybody that's bent on exterminating the Jews, you're wasting your time. So let's move on. Those are sidetracks from the subject, but they're not really the reason for the subject, I believe. So if we go back to Esther, the book, and the person, the 7th chapter of Esther, and the first verse of the chapter, we are going to the second banquet that Esther has prepared for King Ahasuerus and Haman. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther, we're told. And it was the second banquet of wine. And again, the king said to Esther, what's your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom. I think about that whenever I see that was an expression that you hear quoted occasionally from kings of that era. And I wonder if a queen or someone that was offered that said, okay, I'll take that. I'd like to have the kingdom. I wonder what they would get. I don't know. Maybe it was just a formality that they like to express. But anyway, he wants to know what do you want? And at this point, you might criticize Esther for saying, why don't she get to the point? Why is she wasting all the time? And I would suggest that what she's doing is not wasting time. She's capitalizing on the fact that she was chosen out of all of the beauties that they could round up and groom for a year to be queen, wife, and queen, and was able to I would say, be every bit as, if not more, satisfying sexually to the king than any other woman in the area. And she's about to ask him to do something that's really going to be, if he really is attached to Haman, is really going to be tough for him to swallow. And yet she has reason to believe that he has some significant attachment to her. And she's using that. She's not threatening. She's not whining. She's not crying. She's not all panicky. She's demonstrating what Peter talks about for wives in 1 Peter 3, a gentle and a quiet spirit in a terrible time. She's demonstrating what we read in the book of Philippians, I believe, is the peace that passes all understanding. And so she isn't rushed into it, and she isn't panicky, and she doesn't, I would say she probably gives very little indication of the thoughts and maybe the fears that she's able to control to the point that she can function very admirably in a very tough situation. So Queen Esther begins to speak. And on my notes, I usually copy my notes in the New King James, and I kind of highlighted them on the page. And she's going to ask for something, but it's predicated on some other things. She's saying, if this, and if that, and if she's wanting to set the stage in his mind of the good times that they've had for a relatively short time, but the good times that they've had when they've been together. And actually, at the time that she went and first petitioned the king, she said, I haven't seen him in a month. So if you were a new bride and you hadn't seen your husband for a month, and I don't know whether that means they hadn't seen each other at all, or whether that means that they're in an official capacity or in the throne room or something like that. But that's not what she said. She said, I haven't seen you for a month. So this is Esther finally putting in words what's been on her heart and mind since she asked for the first petition with the king. And he says, what's your petition? And so she says, quote, if I have found favor in your sight. First possibility, first reason maybe for rejecting what I want is really what she's giving him. Maybe I haven't found favor in your sight. She's also kind of laying the groundwork for, if you don't grant my request, it would seem to indicate to me that I haven't found favor in your sight. She's thinking. She isn't just shooting off her mouth. She doesn't just crying out for a favor. She's thinking, and she's using choice words fitly spoken. If I have found favor in your sight, O king. And then the second one, if it pleases the king. And then the third one, let my life be given me at my petition. My life is at stake. if you care enough about me, if I please you enough, if I found favor in your sight, and my life is of any value to you, and my people, that's the nature of my request. And she follows. She's not just leaving him hanging out there. She follows through with, this is what happened. We have been sold. Somebody sold us. And if you're the king talking to your queen and she tells you somebody sold you, that his things are probably beginning to spin in his head too. We've been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed. 1, to be killed. 2, and to be annihilated. 3, destroyed, killed, and annihilated. So she gives him at least 3 reasons why maybe he's not willing to do it. Or if he's not willing to do it, she might feel that he doesn't really care that much about her. But then this is not just in the casual, oh, I hate you, I'll kill you. We've been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. And then she says, I'm not, if it hadn't been so severe, it's another statement, for we have been, had we been sold, if it had been different, as female and male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue. Well, I don't know. In my thinking, I would have used my tongue anyway. But that's what she said. She said if it was just we were being sold into bondage, then when we weren't all being exterminated, why I wouldn't have said anything. I'd have held my tongue. But then she is still going to help him make the right decision by saying, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss, even if we were going to be alive, but just sold into slavery, the king would have a terrible loss if we were all put into slavery. So this is, to me, this is a well thought out, I believe inspired by God, actually, but presentation that she's a woman of God in a place where God could use her, as probably no other person in that vicinity could be used. But I like to take it apart, the statement, her presentation that way. I mean, it was laid on a foundation of, we have a relationship, you have a relationship, a value on me, I'm the queen, and I've been sold my life. I've been sold to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we'd just been sold into slavery, I wouldn't have bothered, but this is going to be the end. And even if we were sold into slavery, it would hurt. It would not be in the best interest of the king or the nation. So it was a good presentation. And it wasn't an angry diatribe against the guy that was going to kill him, Haman. And it wasn't a weeping, quivering, sad, fearful, anxious plea for pity from somebody that was been sold to be killed for some reason. So King Ahasuerus listens to this and he answers Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such things? Okay, King Ahasuerus is he's thinking, okay, there's got to be somebody, and I don't have any clue who it would be, but who is he? Where is he? And what he's wanting to do to kill, destroy, that's coming out of his heart. it come out of his heart to do such a thing. And Esther wasn't afraid to state, and she didn't state it in a timid round. You might think, well, I think maybe we ought to have another banquet tomorrow afternoon, and I'll tell you who it was, or any of that kind of thing. She came right to the point. The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. And that causes the king to be angry. And it also causes Haman to be terrified, is the word. So Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. I don't know whether he'd been thinking about what his wife and his counselors had told him about one who would stand against one that was of the Jewish nation or not. I don't know whether he just thought, okay, if I lose my favor with the king and he knows I've tried to take out the Jews. The other thing he would undoubtedly have thought, wow, I didn't know she was a Jew. Why didn't I wonder how come I never found out she was a Jew? Because then he would have known before he asked for the law be passed that that's not going to be a good sell. This lady is a Jew, and these are her people, and the king right now is pretty favorably disposed toward her. I think I better wait a while. I don't know what all was going through his mind, but the inspired account says he was terrified, and his conduct seems to indicate that that's exactly what he was. But I want to take a sidetrack again. When you analyze what Esther did, the intensity of the situation, the seriousness of the law that was passed that would enable the nations that were in Persia at that time to among that 120 contingents or states that was under the control of King Ahasuerus, that was going to be the end of the road for the Jews if that was happened the way it was planned and intended. And so, what for me when I read that, and the question I have is, how would I have responded, or how would I have operated in that situation? And how many times, if we look back and said, how many times did I just panic and just start running off at the mouth? Or how many times did I panic and just go into a ball of tears and couldn't say anything? Or we can think of all kinds of ways that she could have attempted to do something that would have turned into a big ball of confusion, and maybe yelling and screaming and crying and weeping and threatening and promising and all kinds of things that were not going to solve the problem and weren't going to get to the point, and were not to, it's saying the right thing at the right time. And when I go through, I'll say Esther's presentation, if you would put it that way, and the kind of all of what we know about it, because we know if you were Esther, or if you were King Ahasuerus, or if you were Mordecai, or if you're Haman, you had a different set. They all had a different set of facts, or they didn't all have the same facts, and so they all reacted, but they all reacted in a different way. And when Mordecai first goes to Esther, she, of course, at first is saying, I can't do it. That's, you're asking too much of me. But then he reminds her that it may well be that that's why you happen to be the queen, is because God is going to use you to protect your people, our people, his people, God's people. And 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 if you won't, well, he's going to protect us from some other source. So he was not really panicky about the ultimate threat of extermination, annihilation. He's not worried about it because God's not going to let it happen. And I believe everybody that knows the scriptures and studies the scriptures as they watch the Middle East situation in the world today should be able to say, I don't like what's going on. I don't like a lot of things that are being done politically and militarily by other nations outside of the Middle East. I don't want to see Israel hurt. I don't want to see the other nations around them hurt. But what they're doing is not in anybody's best interest. And for Israel, those that want to exterminate them or annihilate them, it isn't going to happen. He'll bring, if the United States goes bankrupt and we can't provide a single bullet for a handheld revolver, to say nothing of the fantastic technology that we have at our disposal that we put at their disposal, and that God, I believe, has used us to protect them. And if we want to turn away and turn against them, actually, one of the things we went over Sunday is that God told those that hate you, well, I will hate. Those that bless you, I will bless. But Esther, being raised by Mordecai, a believer in the Mosaic Law, and probably very knowledgeable of the book of Proverbs, has a lot to say about what we say. And there's a lot of scriptures in the Hebrew scriptures, a lot of, and focused in the book of Proverbs probably as to how we say, why we say, when we say, what we say. But it's repeated in the epistles for the church today. And it doesn't conflict with the basic goal, as it was pointed out in the four Gospels, under the question of the Lord Jesus Christ, that the most important thing and the point of the goal was to demonstrate love for one another. What was in the best interest of other people, all ourselves and everybody else. And so, and today we have people that spend hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours being entertained by watching people interact with other people. And what is amazing to me, and I've said it many times publicly and for many years, but I don't know how anybody has a successful marriage if they don't have any inputs other than what they get from the world, in the entertained world, the music world, the whole thing is upside down. So let's take a few minutes and look through the Proverbs. In Proverbs 15:1, we have something that I think is almost, some people believe it doesn't work, or can't work. A soft answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger. A soft answer turns away wrath. And I'm thinking about it in relationship to people, like your children, like your brothers and sisters, like you as a child with your parents, like husbands and wives, like someone stopped at a traffic stop by a police officer and by the police officer. A soft answer turns away wrath. But a harsh word stirs up anger. And so many times there are situations where police get out of line. I've had it happen to me once or twice where they were not, what they were saying wasn't accurate, wasn't legal, but there was no point in making the point for me because there was nothing I could do about it. If he wrote me a ticket, then we'll see it in court, and if he didn't write a ticket, well, that's the way it is. But harsh words, they're always going to accelerate the thing if you engage in them. And in Proverbs 15:23, the same, there actually is three references to speech in the same proverb. A man has joy by the answer of his mouth. Have you ever had an experience where you were able to think something through and say something? In other words, if you were in Esther's shoes, and there's actually two queens in that story. The other one was Vashti, and you can learn from both of them. Vashti was a queen. She apparently had authority. She had wealth enough. She was doing her own banquet at the same time her husband and the king Ahasuerus was having a banquet. And they were extensive banquets, apparently. And there's a time when he wants her to come and present herself before his guests at his banquet. And she says no. We don't get any conversation in the biblical account, and I don't know that we have any from any other extra biblical sources, but she didn't come, and that was not very smart. It was not godly. It was not orderly, and it cost her position as queen. And the reason used for doing something to her in the way of punishment, and which cost her role as queen, was because she was a terrible influence to other people in the realm. Now then, if everybody in the realm could have followed Vashti and knew what happened, and then they had the privilege to follow Esther and compare or contrast the approach, they might learn something. They might learn something. Esther, I'm sure, could have, and she did as she went on. She got property from that situation. She got esteem from the people in the under the realm of King Ahasuerus. She got money. Mordecai got a place, and he got the privilege of managing the land that Esther was given by the king that used to belong to Haman. So and she took care of it. But if she, and probably as the years went by, she probably could reflect on what was said, what was done, how she did it, and she probably had joy and gratitude to God for what she was able to do. And to extend that in that 15:23, Proverbs 15:23, a word spoken in due season. Okay, how would it have worked if at the first time that she was allowed in, if she presented that whole ball of wax at that point, the first time, when she took her head in her hand, so to speak, and presented herself uninvited in the presence of the king, and he extended his scepter to her and asked her what she wanted and offered her anything she wanted up to half the kingdom. What if she'd have jumped into the whole thing at that point? I don't know. Maybe it would have turned out exactly the same. But she didn't. And I believe that she prayed and fasted, and the Jews that were involved in knowing what was going on prayed and fasted. They wanted God's direction, and God's will, and she was the one that God was going to use and enabled to use uh, uh, something that would be joyful in the final analysis that came out of her mouth. And my point is, you and I can learn from that. We can learn from that. In Proverbs 15:28, the heart of the righteous studies how to answer. Do you stop? It's interesting when Esther presented her case, and King Ahasuerus found out it was Haman, and he's angry, and he goes out and walks in the garden. He doesn't fly off the handle. He goes off and to think, probably, to try to figure out, what am I going to do now? How am I going to handle this? The heart of the righteous studies how to answer, and I'm not trying to make a righteous man out of maybe somebody that was not otherwise a righteous king, but he was in control. But the mouth of the wicked pours forth evil. You know, it's a difference between anger. We're told to be angry but sin not, let not the sun go down on our wrath. And a lot of people get angry and do sin and quote that passage as justification, when in reality it isn't justification at all. Because if you do something that you should ask the person to forgive you for, or you should confess as a sin because it was wrong, you sinned, you're not meeting the criteria. You don't, it's not you lose control of yourself or your temper or your tongue. It's you study how to answer, and if you don't, and you're predisposed that way, some people have a really bad habit of pouring out evil from our mouths. Proverbs 16:1, the preparations of the heart belongs to man. And I understand that to be saying that what I put in my mind, what I put in my heart, what I imitate, what I look up to, what I want to model myself after, that's up to me. I control that. But the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. I think based on how we prepared our heart, there's cause and effect. And what comes out sometimes is a cause of bad preparation of the heart. Proverbs 25:11, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. In other words, to say the right thing at the right time, being the right person, is a beautiful thing. I don't have any mental pictures of apples of gold and settings of silver, but it's obviously intended to describe something that is beautiful and enjoyable to look at. Proverbs 25:4-5 says, take away the dross from silver. Dross is the impurities in the silver, and it'll go to the silversmith for jewelry. In other words, it'll be bright, shiny, pure, clean. They'll make something of value out of it. Take away the dross from silver, and it'll go to the silversmith for jewelry. Take away the wicked from before the king, and his throne will be established in righteousness. And that's really what's going on there with King Ahasuerus and those that he gathers around him, Haman, and his intent was not consistent with what Mordecai's intent was, and Mordecai becomes a very prominent man in his kingdom after Haman is removed from this earth. So the king, as I said, going back to Esther, But think about it, because there's quite a bit of time there laying out what she said, why she said it, this statement on that statement on that statement, this reason, that reason, one, two, three. She does that, I think, three times if I remember correctly, and that that's there for our learning. That's for our benefit. So she says what happened. The Haman is terrified. The king leaves the room, and in his wrath, he from the banquet of wine, he goes into the palace garden. And Haman stood before Queen Esther and is pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. Yeah, I would think you wouldn't have to be too smart to figure that out. And so he's pleading with, and we don't have any record of what he said, but it didn't work, whatever it was. So then in verse 8 of chapter 7, the king comes back in, and by this time, apparently, Esther was sitting on a couch of some kind or something, and the king returned from the palace, and Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was sitting or lying, whatever. And the king said, "Will he also assault the queen while I'm in my house?" In other words, I don't know whether he thought that's what Haman was doing rather than appeal for his life, or whether he just chose to interpret it that way. I don't know. And it's interesting, though, that, and when I see this picture, I try to picture it in my mind. You're in a throne room. There's the king there. There's Haman. There's Esther. There's this bombshell has been dropped in the middle of his life, King Ahasuerus' life, and Haman's life. And Haman is pleading for his life, maybe not conscious that he's getting a little bit too much into her space, you might say, as she's sitting or lying on a couch. And the king comes in and accuses him of assaulting the queen while he, the king, is even in the house. And the next phrase is pretty dramatic. As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. That's the second time Haman had covered himself. He covered his own head after he had to lead Mordecai around the town saying, "This is what's done to the man that the king wants to honor." And this time he didn't cover somebody did it for him. And again, I see it in a certain way in my mind that I don't know whether it's really true, but that probably as the king is there, he's interviewing people, he's talking to people, there's palace guards that are there, there's probably somebody that's in charge of the palace guards. They're stationed in different places around the room. I don't know how many of them had what I would think was a bag, like a bag, big enough to go over their head, down their shoulders, and probably trap their hands and arms inside the bag. And all the sergeant or the lieutenant or whatever his rank was, if he knew who was going to move on Haman if it got to that point, and it got to that point, and in my mind he just goes like that, and two guys move, and one guy puts the bag over his head, and they grab him, and out he goes, and really it's all over for him. There's no trial, there's no appeal, there's no Supreme Court. His fate is sealed. And one of the eunuchs that was there by the name of Harbona says, "Look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman." And the king says, "Hang him on it." And so they hanged Haman, and the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's wrath subsided. Now, that's not the end of the story. I may stop there, I may not. I can't seem to get to the end of the story. But think about it. That's the end of the story for Haman. And that's the opening up of the story, really, for uh, Queen Esther and for Mordecai and their prominence in the kingdom and their wealth and their reputation and all of that. And for the nation Israel, a time of rejoicing that that other Jews for years after continued. As far as I know, they probably still do. Uh, so it pays to allow God to guide and direct in the things you say, because they're based on the things that you've probably allowed to go into your mind or put into your mind yourself. And are they good examples? Is your life a good testimony or a Vashti testimony? And I'll close for that, and I'll decide what to do for the future. And I would ask you to hit the like button if you can, subscribe if you would like to, and we look forward to seeing you this coming Sunday. May the Lord bless you. Goodbye.